What if the most dangerous man in the Roman Empire was not a general, a senator, or an emperor, but a preacher with no army, no wealth, and no interest in pleasing the powerful? John Chrysostom did not conquer cities with swords, he conquered consciences with words. His voice shook emperors, emptied palaces, filled hospitals, and ultimately cost him his freedom and his life. This is the story of the man whose mouth was called golden, whose will was forged in suffering, and whose sermons proved that truth spoken clearly is more threatening than any rebellion. This is the life of John Chrysostom. In the year 347 AD, the city of Antioch was a bustling metropolis of the Roman East, a place where the scent of expensive spices from the Silk Road mingled with the intellectual dust of ancient schools. Into this world of prestige, John was born. His father, Secundus, was a high-ranking military officer, but he died while John was still an infant. This left his upbringing to his mother, Anthusa, a woman of such profound character that she remained a widow at 20 to devote herself entirely to her son's education. Her piety was so evident that even the pagan rhetorician Libanius famously remarked, "What women these Christians have." Anthusa's refusal to seek a new husband was a radical social statement that protected John's inheritance and provided him with a sanctuary of stability in a volatile era. John was given the premier intellectual culture of the age. He studied under Libanius himself, the most celebrated orator of the century. There, John mastered the art of rhetoric, the power of logic, and the rhythm of the Greek language. He was Libanius's star pupil, and legend says that as the master lay dying, he was asked who should succeed him. He replied with a sigh, "It would have been John, had not the Christians stolen him." Libanius recognized that John possessed a rare, theatrical energy in his speech, a quality that could sway a courtroom or a mob. Libanius often used John's speeches as the gold standard for his other students, marveling at how the boy could weave classical mythology with contemporary legal theory. While John excelled in these classical studies, his heart began to turn toward the philosophy of the cross. He was deeply influenced by the ascetic movements of the time, seeing the hollow victories of the legal courts as vanity. This internal tension between his secular brilliance and his growing spiritual hunger defined his youth, eventually leading him to seek baptism and renounce his promising career in law for the service of the church. The education John received was not merely about grammar, it was about the psychology of the audience. He learned how to use pause, tone, and metaphors to arrest the attention of a distracted crowd. He discovered that a speaker's greatest tool was not his vocabulary, but his ability to mirror the secret anxieties and hopes hidden within his listeners' hearts. This mastery over the spoken word became his primary weapon, allowing him to pierce through the cynicism of Roman society with a clarity that made the scriptures feel alive and dangerous rather than distant and academic. John's rhetorical training taught him the value of the kairos, the opportune moment. He understood that a sermon was not just a lecture, but a spiritual event that required a perfect harmony of timing and truth. This background in the sophist tradition gave him a distinct edge over other theologians of his day, as he could synthesize complex Greek logic with the simple, searing ethics of the gospel, making him equally accessible to the unlettered dockworkers of the Orontes and the sophisticated scholars of the city. His ability to simplify the profound without diluting its power made him a rare bridge between the academy and the street, a skill that few possessed. John's rhetorical training taught him the value of the opportune moment. This background in the sophist tradition gave him a distinct edge over other theologians of his day, as he could synthesize complex Greek logic with the simple, searing ethics of the gospel. He understood that to reach the heart, one must first master the ear. He utilized the grand style of Roman oratory to defend the humble carpenter of Nazareth, creating a paradoxical power that fascinated even the pagans of Antioch. By treating the gospel as a superior form of philosophy, he forced the educated elites of Antioch to confront the radical claims of Christ on their own intellectual turf. Despite the promise of a brilliant legal career, John felt a spiritual emptiness. After his baptism by Bishop Melesius, he initially stayed at home to care for his mother, but upon her death, he fled to the mountains to pursue the true philosophy of monasticism. For 4 years he lived with an elderly monk, and then for 2 years he withdrew to a solitary cave. This period of mourning for his mother transitioned into a mourning for the world, as he sought to strip away every earthly comfort to find God. During this time, John committed the entire New Testament to memory. However, his extreme asceticism, living without fire and sleeping on the bare earth, permanently shattered his health. He developed chronic stomach and kidney issues that would plague him for life. Realizing his body could no longer survive the desert, he returned to Antioch in 381. He had left a rhetorician. He returned a vessel of the word. The 2 years he spent in absolute solitude were the most transformative of his life. He reportedly stood for hours without sleep, a practice that caused his legs to swell and his digestive system to slow. His physical suffering became a silent prayer, a way to participate in the afflictions of Christ, while his mind worked to harmonize the entirety of Scripture. These desert scars became his badge of honor. He believed that a priest who had not conquered his own flesh could never hope to guide the souls of others. His return to the city was not a retreat from his vows, but a strategic move. He realized that the gospel was not meant to be hidden in a cave, but shouted from the rooftops. His weakened body served as a constant reminder that his strength came not from his own vitality, but from the spirit he had studied so intensely in the silence. His pale complexion and frail frame only added to his mystique, making his booming, rhythmic voice seem like a supernatural occurrence to those who heard him. In this isolation, John developed his literal historical approach to the text. While others saw the Bible as a puzzle of hidden codes, John saw it as a vibrant history of God's dealings with humanity. He began to write his first treatises during these years, arguing that the monastic life was not an escape from responsibility, but a preparation for a war against the spiritual corruption of the urban centers he would soon re-enter. He practiced watchfulness, a state of constant, prayerful attention that he believed was necessary to guard the soul. This period of intense suffering and introspection convinced him that the greatest threat to the church was not external persecution, but internal apathy. By focusing on the plain sense of the word, he grounded his theology in the messy, practical reality of human life rather than in ethereal abstractions. He began to write his first treatises during these years, arguing that the monastic life was not an escape from responsibility, but a preparation for a war against the spiritual corruption of the urban centers he would soon re-enter. He practiced watchfulness, a state of constant prayerful attention that he believed was necessary to guard the soul. This period of intense suffering and introspection convinced him that the greatest threat to the church was not external persecution, but internal apathy. By the time he descended from the mountains, he possessed a terrifying clarity of purpose. He viewed every sermon as a battlefield where the souls of his congregation were either won for the kingdom or lost to the distractions of the world. Ordained a priest in 386, John spent the next 12 years in the pulpit of the great church. He practiced the Antiochene method of preaching, focusing on the literal and historical meaning of Scripture rather than abstract allegories. His sermons were electric. He scolded the wealthy for their ivory beds while the poor shivered in the streets, famously teaching that there were two altars, one in the church and one in the person of the beggar. His words acted like a mirror, forcing the congregants to see the grotesque disparity between their religious rituals and their treatment of the needy. His greatest trial in Antioch came in 387 during the affair of the statues. After a tax riot led to the toppling of imperial statues, the city lived in terror of the emperor's wrath. While Bishop Flavian traveled to beg for mercy, John stayed in the pulpit, delivering 21 homilies that calmed the populace and turned a political crisis into a spiritual revival. By the time a pardon arrived, John was the undisputed moral heart of the East. He proved that the church was the only institution capable of holding the fabric of society together when the state turned its sword toward its own citizens. He used this crisis to teach the people that their fear of an earthly emperor was a shadow of the awe they should feel for God. He preached daily for weeks, his voice echoing through a city that had gone silent with dread. When the news of the imperial pardon finally reached the city, the people credited John's prayers as much as Flavian's diplomacy. This period established John as a social critic. He refused to separate spirituality from economics, arguing that if a Christian possessed excess while his neighbor starved, he was a thief. His radical economic theology was not based on political theory, but on the profound belief that all wealth belonged to God and was merely on loan. His homilies on the book of Genesis and the epistles of Paul from this era are still considered the pinnacle of patristic commentary. He frequently utilized diatribe, a rhetorical technique where he would voice the objections of his listeners and then systematically dismantle them with scriptural logic. This made his sermons feel like a dialogue rather than a lecture, engaging the audience so deeply that they often erupted in applause, a practice John tried to stop, telling them that the only applause he desired was the reformation of their lives. He was a master of the uncomfortable truth, often using sharp wit and biting sarcasm to expose the hypocrisy of those who sought to bargain with God. This made his sermons feel like a dialogue rather than a lecture, engaging the audience so deeply that they often erupted in spontaneous applause, a practice John tried to stop, telling them that the only applause he desired was the reformation of their lives. He would often stop mid-sentence to address someone whispering in the back, or to mock the fancy clothing of a noblewoman sitting in the front row, proving that the great church was a place of divine accountability, not social posturing. This unpredictable, interactive style made his services the most popular events in the city, drawing crowds that far exceeded the capacity of the building. In 398, John's fame became his undoing. The imperial court in Constantinople wanted the world's greatest preacher for their capital. Knowing John would refuse to leave Antioch, the emperor's advisor, Eutropius, had him kidnapped under the guise of an imperial consultation and driven under guard to Constantinople. The plot was so secret that even the local authorities in Antioch were left baffled by the sudden disappearance of their most famous citizen. He was consecrated as archbishop against his will, but he did not compromise. He immediately began a campaign of radical reform, selling the bishop's luxury furnishings to build hospitals and demanding moral purity from a corrupt clergy. When the very man who kidnapped him, Eutropius, fell from power and sought sanctuary in the church, John protected him, preaching a world-famous sermon on the vanity of earthly power, while the fallen eunuch cowered beneath the altar. This moment solidified John's reputation as a man whose loyalty to the gospel surpassed his personal grievances or the shifting winds of politics. John's refusal to participate in the lavish dinner parties of the nobility deeply offended the old guard of the capital. He also launched missions to the Gothic tribes, sending preachers to the outskirts of the empire to bring the gospel to those the Romans considered barbarians. This expansion of the church's reach only increased his fame among the common people. He reformed the order of widows and established strict oversight of church finances, ensuring that every gold coin went toward communal care. John's arrival in the capital was like a monk walking into a masquerade ball. He removed the expensive carpets from the episcopal residence and replaced them with straw mats, symbolizing his return to apostolic simplicity. His lifestyle was a constant, silent rebuke to the opulence of the imperial court, creating an atmosphere of spiritual tension that could not be ignored. He insisted that the clergy under his jurisdiction act as servants rather than lords, and he often spent his evenings visiting the hospitals he had founded, personally tending to the needs of the city's most vulnerable residents. He reformed the order of widows and established strict oversight of church finances, ensuring that every gold coin went toward communal care rather than clerical comfort. This moral cleaning of the capital acted like a shock to the system. He famously refused to host the customary archiepiscopal banquets, arguing that the money belonged to the poor and that he had no right to consume it with the rich. John's greatest antagonist was the Empress Eudoxia. While she initially admired him, his sermons against the vanity of the wealthy felt like personal attacks. Simultaneously, ecclesiastical rivals led by Theophilus of Alexandria orchestrated the 403 Synod of the Oak, a sham trial featuring 46 trumped-up charges. Eudoxia provided the political muscle, while Theophilus provided the theological cover for what was essentially a coup d'etat against the See of Constantinople. Briefly banished and then recalled after a terrifying earthquake, John's peace was short-lived. When a silver statue of Eudoxia was erected near his church, John's temper flared. He famously compared the empress to Herodias, demanding the head of John the Baptist on a platter. This sermon was the point of no return. By speaking so boldly, John knew he was trading his earthly safety for his spiritual integrity. In 404, the emperor signed the order for his final, permanent banishment. The political maneuvering of Theophilus was particularly venomous. He used the Tall Brothers, a group of monks John had protected, as a wedge to accuse John of Origenism, a heresy John did not even subscribe to. This illustrated the dark side of Byzantine ecclesiology, where theological labels were often used as cloaks for political assassinations. John stood firm through it all, refusing to attend the illegal synod and maintaining that only a legitimate council could judge a bishop. The conflict was ultimately about the independence of the church from the state. As John was marched out of the city toward the harsh frontiers of Armenia, a mysterious fire razed the great church. This destruction was blamed on his followers, giving the state a legal pretext to persecute the Johannites. John eventually died in exile, exhausted by forced marches, leaving the smoldering ruins of the Hagia Sophia as a grim testament to the high cost of standing against the imperial will. John was sent into exile in the remote mountains of Armenia. Even from afar, his influence persisted through a massive network of letters to his supporters, including the Deaconess Olympias. Frustrated by his continued relevance, his enemies ordered him moved to the edge of the known world, Pitsunda, on the Black Sea. His letters from this period, filled with encouragement and pastoral care, became a lifeline for a church that felt abandoned by its shepherd. His guards were instructed to show him no mercy. For 3 months, they forced the 60-year-old man to travel on foot through freezing rain and scorching heat. During this brutal march, John was often mocked and spat upon by his handlers, yet he famously prayed for them, mimicking the Christ he had preached for decades. His endurance transformed the trek into a mobile cathedral. Wherever he stopped, the locals recognized him as a saint in chains. He wrote to his followers to remain faithful, telling them that the storm is loud, but the rock is firm. On September 14, 407, at a small chapel in Comana, John's body finally failed. He requested clean white robes, received the Eucharist, and died with the words, "Glory to God for all things." A lasting legacy. The sheer brutality of his treatment eventually backfired on the court. As news of his dignified death spread like wildfire, the common people began to view him not just as a bishop, but as a living martyr. Every step he took in agony had only served to amplify his message, proving that his faith was not a matter of words, but of profound, living endurance. His death in such a humble, remote location was a fitting end for a man who had always championed the marginalized over the powerful. His influence reached far beyond the 5th century, shaping the theology of the Protestant reformers and modern social teachings. He remains the patron saint of preachers, a reminder that the voice of truth cannot be silenced by walls or wilderness. Every time a priest chants his liturgy, the golden mouth speaks again. John's insistence on the mystery of the neighbor redefined leadership and social responsibility, fueling the development of hospitals and orphanages throughout the Byzantine Empire and later Europe. He taught the world that the most beautiful cathedral ever built was not one of stone, but the human heart opened by the grace of God and the service of others. Even today, his Paschal homily is read in every Orthodox church on Easter morning. This ensures that his most joyful and hopeful words, rather than the bitterness of his exile, have the final say in the history of the faith. His legacy is found in the living breath of every sermon that seeks to bring heaven down to earth. If this story challenges how you think about preaching, power, and faith lived publicly, stay with us. Subscribe to Theology today for long-form, historically grounded narratives on the figures who shaped Christianity, not through legend, but through courage, conviction, and costly obedience. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter in this series. Like the video to support this work, and share it with someone who believes faith should still speak truth to power.